Thank you so much. It's an incredible honor to be able to give this lecture. I only wish that I was able to actually do it live, but understanding and these virtual platforms are remarkable to be able to bring to you our best practices. And I hope that there's opportunity for learning and for understanding a little bit about the history of how we got to this place and what we would, how this is going to enhance your not just reviewing, but also authorship in the future. So I have a few disclosures. The ones that are relevant to this talk are that I serve as an associate editor for both the Journal of Urology and Neurourology and Urodynamics, our premier subspecialty journal. Those things only impact in the fact that I have a lot of insider knowledge as to the way that the mechanisms of how manuscript review occurs at the level of the journal, being an editor. And so I encourage you, if you have questions, to reach out on the chat during this talk, or later on, I'll give my email at the very end, and I'm happy to discuss those. I'd like to acknowledge many people who've given me opportunity to be here today, including Deborah Erickson, who was the first female at the helm and as an associate editor of the Journal of Urology, Jay Smith, who was the editor when I became an associate editor, and then many people, including our current editor, who've given me lots of knowledge and training and understanding more about peer review. And so you really can't know where you're going until you know where you've been. This is our poet Maya Angelou, and it's an incredibly true statement, particularly when you're talking about how we look at manuscripts and peer-reviewed journals. I'm going to give you a little bit of history of the Journal of Urology. It started at the first issue was in February of 1917. And this is actually a copy that I have on my desk in my office. And the reason I have this copy was that our library, in all its infinite wisdom at Vanderbilt, when everything went digital, they decided they were just going to throw away massive amounts of documents. And I happened to be walking by. This is a true story. And I saw this Journal of Urology in its bound version. And I said, well, that's interesting. They're throwing this away. I picked it up, and it happened to be the very first journal, the very first printing. And the editor was Hugh Hampton Young, of course. It was the official organ of the American Urological Association. It's been our first indexed journal in the specialty. It's obviously the most widely read journal in the field and the most frequently cited. And for those of you who are facile at social media, has more followers on Twitter than any urology journal. And we've been very successful in taking snapshots and single pages that give us synopsis of the entire article for dissemination on the social media platforms. This was the very first article, study on the growth of cells, cultivation of bladder and prostatic tumors outside the body. As you can see, it was really an international contingency that was partaking. There were often articles early on venereal disease, tuberculosis, prostate. Our very first female author was Isabel Watson in 1920. But you see there were landmark articles on radical cystectomy, need for evidence-based surgery. We were having this argument as early as 1922, IVPs in 1931. We first started to look at associations of surgeon volume with outcomes as early as 1937. We all thought this was such a big trend in the 90s to create this metric, but really it was 100 years old. Castration for cancer of the prostate in 1942. Penicillin, one of our landmark antibiotics in the 1940s for gonorrhea. And of course, urine cytology. This was a very interesting article about total cystectomy. And in 1924, they've decided that it's an obsolete operation for treatment of bladder cancer. It just goes to show you what our literature really is composed of and how we can go about changing that dynamic with great peer review. Other ones, of course, Hugh Hampton Young with the treatment with radical prostatectomy. And not soon after, there was commentary about this Dr. Dossett, who is lost to history, unfortunately, says this technique that he's proposed has partial or total incontinence, and the late results are very mediocre. So still, there was always debate, and we encourage that to this day in the Journal of Urology. When we look at contemporary publishing, we kind of evaluate an impact factor. And this has become an important metric when we look at the, what gravitas and what reach a journal has. And really it's an artificial metric. It's the number of citations over the past several years divided by the number of citable items. And that's all that it really means. And you can manipulate that incredibly. So different journals, just like you can manipulate, we have a metric in the United States called the U.S. News and World Reports that kind of ranks all the hospitals, all the urology programs, all the residencies, and it's completely artificial. And the impact factor indeed is another artificial metric, and you can push it one way or the other for your journal. Now, journals such as the New England Journal of Medicine, which is arguably the premier journal of all of medicine, has an impact factor of 176. But we're very happy to tell you, though, at the Journal of Urology, even though our impact factor is magnitudes lower at 7.6, it's been steadily increasing over time. And over the past decade has doubled, meaning that we're being more selective in how we impact and reach our readership. So we're here to do what our readership demands, which is provide the highest level of evidence for urology and to have the articles that are the highest impact for your clinical practice and your research initiatives. And when we look at the impact factor terms, of course, it clusters around prostate cancer. It actually clusters, though, for overactive bladder and some infertility. But it's not just impact factor anymore. I know I talked about a little earlier social media components. Well, now there's a different type of factor called altmetric, and it takes into account social media and online news outlets. I don't think I need to impress upon this audience how we all know that as of late, this can be extraordinarily disruptive and potentially just not accurate. And so what's going to come of the social media and really ramp up the impact of the article? Well, you get on Science News because you're riding roller coasters to dislodge kidneys or doing penis transplants. We know that in general, these things in the field are of very low clinical impact, but overall are going to be splashy and end up with a tremendous number of hits because of the social media component. When we look at international trends, and this is one of the delights of speaking to an international audience, is that overall world publications are growing by 4% per year. And it turns out that there's some countries like China that are publishing significantly more than prior years, and some countries like the US and Japan that are actually publishing less. But what I'm proud of and what I want you to know is that in the Journal of Urology, it used to be, so early on, obviously 1917 to 1926, we had very, very few international submissions. And even though we are the official journal of the American Urological Association, we like to think of ourselves as an international journal, which means your submissions are important. Your submissions are taken with the same level as any submission from the United States. And in fact, international submissions dominate what comes across our editorial desk at this time. So I just want to tell you we're welcoming. We understand, and we'll talk a little bit about this later. Sometimes there are grammatical and language barriers, and oftentimes We can overcome that if the science is robust, if the science is valid. We are going to do everything we can to give you a platform for your research. But and again, back to Maya Angelou, nothing will work unless you do. And the entire process of journal publication at this juncture is predicated on us as a communal society, us as a group of scientists, us as a group of clinicians coming together to make this happen. It's not done in isolation, and it's not done outside the purview of exactly what all of you are doing every day, which is trying to do the right thing, the best thing for your patient. We all rely on each other to disseminate the highest level of evidence. And so peer review is not a new concept. It's been around as far as we can trace it back from 921 in Turkey. And the first peer-reviewed publication was actually from the Royal Society of Edinburgh on medical essays and observations as early as 1731. This was part of our process. But until the late 19th century, it was really just the editor-in-chief, basically, who came across and reviewed all the information that was going to be. It was a peer review, but it was all singular as to one professor who was making those determinations. And it really wasn't in widespread use until the mid-20th century. And I'll give you a little tidbit. Journals like The Lancet that we've all heard of that are amazing in their high impact now, it wasn't until 1973 that The Lancet actually opened up to what we consider now true peer review. So why do we do this? And why is it so important? Why have I been brought here today to talk to you about this? Because it's your opportunity to expand knowledge. If you don't know how to accomplish a really good peer review, engage a mentor, engage someone to assist. We are all happy to send a manuscript, get your review, and then give feedback about that review. There's so many people who want to help and want you to be part of the process. It is a significant service to all of urology when you perform these things. And it really, really hones your skills for your own manuscript composition. There's nothing better than reading lots of manuscripts for you to determine the best ways to communicate information that are going to give your data the highest impact. And of course, coming back in the end, it's evidence-based care for your patients. It is helping you expand your knowledge set because we're giving you manuscripts that are in your purview of interest. And so you get to see data long before it's published and understand the real landscape and read about the background and read about the discussions and really engage in this information. And as well, if you do this for the Journal of Urology, we have an option where you can get medical education certificates if that's important for you in your practice. But there's lots of complexities. It's still a human endeavor. There's still lots of uncertainty and unconscious bias. So we are working very hard to try to eliminate some of this, but who knows what people's time is. If you're going to do a review, I ask that you be sure that you have the time to do it appropriately, or else just pass. If you don't have the bandwidth within the next several weeks to accomplish it, it's fine. Just pass on it. We'll not come back to you. We will come back to you for further reviews, especially if you say it's just not a good time to do it. And when we choose reviewers for manuscripts, there's always going to be some personal and unconscious bias that occurs. Traditionally, manuscript review is what we call a single blinded process. And what that means is that the authors don't know the reviewers, but the reviewers know the authors. Now you can imagine if you get a manuscript and it has a very famous individual who's the primary author of that, you're going to think differently about it than you would if you didn't know who had written it. And we'll get back to the fact that it can be very disruptive. This is the way that it works at Journal of Urology. We have a single blinded process. At neurourology and urodynamics, we have a double blinded process. The double blinded process indicates that the reviewers or the authors don't know each other at all. Now, there's caveats to this. You know, the Lancet editor that I brought up earlier said that peer review is a quasi-sacred process, but we know it's biased, we know it's unjust, we know it's unaccountable, incomplete, easily fixed, often insulting, usually ignorant, occasionally foolish, and frequently wrong. There are issues with the way that we have the process set up, but it doesn't mean there's not opportunities for improvement. And one of the things that we've done at the Journal of Urology as of October of 2021 is try to invoke some transparency into the process. And this transparency includes giving for all the manuscripts that are accepted, publishing your peer review. It's very valuable because it gives everyone the opportunity, if they choose, to look at our peer review report to see exactly what the deficits that were brought up in the manuscript are, so you can look at it with a different light. It also gives you opportunity, if you were one of the reviewers of the manuscript, to see what other people said. That's so very important when you're trying to judge how I looked at a manuscript. What things did I miss? What things did I find that someone else didn't bring up? It's very important when you're honing those skills. So I encourage you to look through the peer review reports for any of the manuscripts that you're reading in the Journal of Urology, and they're available online. But there's caveats to this, which means everything is in one big peer review report, and my particular reviews aren't allocated to me. And I can choose to not have my name associated as well with the peer review report. So in this one, it says that I was actually one of the editors that worked on the review, but there were anonymous reviewers as well. So it gives you a little bit of latitude. So some generalities about peer review, and then we're going to dig in for the remainder of the talk of exactly the best practices on how to do this. What's your goal? Your goal as a peer reviewer is to try to improve that manuscript for the authors. We go through and we'll write things and we read them and we read them again, and you lose sight of how this is going to be actually, viewed by the readership. So you want to try to do everything you can to make this a better manuscript for the authors. So even if I read a manuscript and I know that it's not actually going to be the impact of the manuscript that we would endeavor for in the Journal of Urology, I still want to assist those authors with publication. And we take great pride in being able to give you some type of feedback in the journal. So be constructive. Even if it is a manuscript that really, most of those don't make it to reviewer status, is that we do what's called a desk rejection or triage. But try to be constructive in your commentary. You're trying to help your peers who are authors do the right thing and improve their manuscript. And I'll always tell people, read it twice. My personal protocol is I'll read through a manuscript, and sometimes you read an abstract and think, oh, this is not going to be valuable data. But then you read the introduction and put it in context, and then you read deeper. So I'll read it, make a few notes, and then put it away, and then come back to it later, because you want to give it time for the entire process to understand the context that these authors have gone through to get this data set together. So I always encourage everyone, don't make judgment on something just by first glances. Shelve your personal bias as much as possible. If you're deeply engaged in the field and you think you can do better, maybe you can, but this is really not your time to do that. And again, don't perseverate on writing styles, on grammatical errors. We can, if there's barriers in that way, we can often edit that later on. If it's solid science, it's solid science, and we can overcome that. And again, read the other reviewer comments to see if you were on target and if they revealed issues you missed, so you'll be a better reviewer and more thoughtful about particular aspects next time around. So we look at this as, I kind of look at it as a three component. You want to recap their hypothesis and findings in your initial statement. You want to look at major comments, that 30,000 foot view. You want to let the editors and the authors know that this really is important data that fits into and helps drive our science forward or helps drive our clinical care forward. We want to know in this general overview, is there a major design flaw? Is this a retrospective study that has giant pitfalls that we really can't extrapolate the data? Is this a randomized controlled trial? You always want to question the science and see, is this something that you would implement in your practice or that you believe is going to drive your research forward after reading that manuscript? Is it that level? You can have comments to the author, and these are the ones where you individually section or bullet point comments, and I'll show you both of those. I prefer to have numbered or bullet point comments to the author. You can divide that into each one of the sections. Some reviewers like to say introduction, no concerns, methods, and then go into what the statistical analysis that they should have done or where the p-values are. Each of these, however you do it, I really encourage you to do numbers to your commentary or bullet points to your commentary. It is so much easier for an editor to evaluate and for the author to respond to. Paragraphs of information can get lost and your points may not get across as succinctly to the authors. If there's something really unique, I appreciate a personal comment that says, well, this manuscript may fit into the context, but the authors have not taken into account X, Y, and Z, or this manuscript will have higher impact and broad-reaching implications, or this manuscript is better suited for urology practice, secondary to the nature of the types of analyses that they did. We also, you can say whatever you want. The comments to the editor are completely confidential. Try to be as genteel as possible when you use them. I've had some very vicious comments directed at the authors sent to me through comments to the editor. So I encourage you to really just try to give me an idea if there's major flaws that can be overcome and why you made your decision. And you'll be asked to make a final recommendation, and that can be major revision, minor revision, reject and transfer to another journal that's maybe in the Journal of Urology publication spectrum. We're just asking for your gestalt about your instinct. Does this need to be published and give them a chance to revise, or is the data such that you would recommend it not be published in the Journal of Urology? So this is one example. They said the well thought out conceived study that increases our knowledge in a few questions, and then they numbered the questions. This is very easy for a author to expound on and give me answers when it comes back for a revision. This is another example, equally valid, where they've said introduction, clearly written. I suggest moving aims and hypothesis to the end. Methods, please list. Results, suggest separating. So again, I like some type of structure instead of run-on sentences. It really helps the authors. You should look at the title. It should be a sentence that really describes the paper, and it shouldn't be lengthy. Stent omission in pre-stented patients undergoing ureteroscopy decreases unplanned healthcare utilization. I understand everything that you're going to be talking about. It doesn't run on, it doesn't have a lot of commas or semicolons that really lose you in the impact, short and to the point. The abstract should be succinct, but it's like a mini paper. Really, you should make sure, and we'll make sure before you see it, that it meets all the metrics of the structure of the journal. But you can read it and get an idea of what's happening, but it's really not a surrogate for reading the entire manuscript. And I think that everyone in their training has gone through and really used abstracts as a way to get data. The take-home message is there, and so that's great, but it doesn't give you a full view. But it should be succinct, it should include the main outcomes, and it should include an impactful take-home message. Interestingly, there's medical subject headings. These are called mesh terms. And sometimes authors will be asked to put these mesh terms in so they can be indexed better. What I want you to avoid if you're an author is using the same words that are in your title, because those are automatically indexed. So pick things that are going to draw in people when they do a PubMed search for your article that are different than what's in the title. So this is the place where the authors set context. Introductions are so important. They need to build an argument that tells me why this data is important, why their research, what's the rationale, what's the gap in knowledge, and how they're answering that gap. As an expert in the field, you'll often look at this and say, you know what? They didn't really think about a reference that you know about. We need to be able to know that, and you need to point it out to the authors. Sometimes they're going to bias the references that are used based on what their argument is and what they're trying to prove. So be careful about that, but always bring it up when you look at the introduction. Did their aims and objectives actually define the question that they're asking? So in the methods section, this is often the one that's most difficult for many reviewers to tackle, because there can be some very sophisticated analyses. But did they adequately describe the techniques? Even if you're not as agile and facile in what those techniques are, can you tell that they adequately describe them? Can you follow through what they intended to do? And if you were going to replicate this study at your institution, did they give you enough information so you could replicate it? Did they give you what their primary outcome was, what their secondary outcome was? If they used validated instruments, did they describe and reference those? And of course, was there institutional review board approval if they're using human subjects and controlled information from patients? Now, this is one we all struggle with. Were the appropriate statistics used? Did they do a power and sample size calculation? Here's where I encourage you. Most of us are not biostatisticians. We learned enough in most instances to be able to do some rudimentary understanding and maybe even some of the programs, but that doesn't make you a biostatistician. It is an incredibly complex array of knowledge that goes into that. And that's why we have a group, we have a panel, we have an entire editorial board of statisticians who are there to help. You know, there's different levels of evidence, and we're all aware, and we all want all the evidence to be randomized controlled trials. But the fact is that they're not. Those are very cumbersome. Sometimes they're impossible to do in a surgical discipline. And it is very, very difficult in most instances, and they're very expensive, very difficult in most instances to have those as part of the metric. Because indeed, when we even look at the use of randomized studies, the ones that mostly do randomized studies are drug studies, right? They're pharmaceutical compounds where they can give a placebo, they can randomize patients. But for most things, it's very, very difficult. So I would say less than a half or a third of the articles that we see are well-constructed randomized studies. And well-constructed is another part of that metric. And some things just can't be randomized. This is an article that came out several years ago, and it was a parody, so a joke about parachute use, right? You can't do a randomized control trial on use of a parachute jumping out of an airplane. And then there's some studies that don't even have references. This is Einstein's theory of relativity, the electrodynamics of moving bodies. And if you look, there's absolutely no references because there was no context. There was nothing that came before this. So for revolutionary, truly revolutionary ideas, there may not even be references because it's not possible. So we have to have some latitude when we review literature. But we have guidelines, and there are reporting guidelines. There are so many different ones. And I encourage you, if you're going to be in doing systematic reviews, reviewing systematic reviews, to understand and look at what all these acronyms mean, just so you have an idea. What's a PRISMA guideline? What are consort structures when we look at manuscripts? Because it's important when you try to evaluate the manuscript that they follow the rules. But this is particular for randomized control trials and systematic reviews. You know, data didn't make any sense. We're going to have to resort to statistics. This is where we ask for help. This is where we utilize and leverage our statistical review board. And indeed, Melissa Assel, who is the lead biostatistician of the Journal of Urology, and Andrew Vickers, they've written manuscripts about guidelines for reporting statistics. So if you're an author or if you're going to be doing peer review, I encourage you to just briefly review these. There's very similar mistakes that authors make again and again and again. It's like the top 5 that Melissa will bring up when she does the review, and you may be able to pick those up even before it goes to statistical review. There's also guidelines for reporting of figures and tables in clinical research in urology. And again, this is extraordinarily important, particularly if you're going to be sending manuscripts in and when you're looking at tables and figures. So the results section, they should present the data very clearly. Check a couple of data points. Do the numbers add up? Is the sample size the same as what they say in the text and the tables? It should be straightforward. You should be able, anyone who's reading that manuscript should be able to look at that data set and see how that fits in. Did they do what they said they were going to do in the methods? Sometimes people add tables, figures, and graphs. Do they really help? This is not a time for discussion of the results. This is just a time to report your results. They should avoid commentary that really explains the data and just give us the data. The discussion is the time where they put this back into context. They tell the end of the story. They tell us why the data answered the questions, how it fit into their hypothesis, and how it fits into the literature. So when you look at a discussion, really have the eye. Does this study add something? Does it add something to the literature? Is it going to change how I care for patients? Is it going to change how future research is done in this field? Do not let them introduce new data. The other thing that is incredibly important, and I think every author should do at the end of a manuscript, is tell me, and this helps you as a reviewer too, what do they think the strengths of the data set they have are, and what are the weaknesses? Because this will help you sometimes when you read that, go back and see, yes, it's true, they really didn't have the sample size to answer this question, but it's a very important question, and what they've done sets the context for bigger studies in the future. And the conclusion, it should be a very strong take-home message. It should tell you what the objectives were and how they met the objectives. In this one where they said compared to radical prostatectomy, external beam radiation therapy with low-dose brachytherapy boost associated with meaningful worse urinary, irritative, obstructive, and bowel function but better urinary incontinence function through 5 years. That's exactly what they had proposed to do, and is exactly what they found. And this is then culminated in a very concise conclusion. Some reviewers, and Susskind, who's an assistant editor at the Journal of Urology, taught me this. She goes and looks at the figures and tables first. So she'll read the title, read the abstract, and then go straight to the figures and tables, because that's really where the meat of the data is. Oftentimes when I'm reviewing the manuscript, I'll have the manuscript up on one screen and then put the figures and tables on a second so I can go back and forth, because it's important. They should not just duplicate data. There should be something there that's impactful. Visual impact in a figure matters tremendously. Too much data in a table gets lost. When you look at this figure, you know exactly what's happening between prostate cancer and breast cancer over this time period when we had PSA screening, and when we that it decreased the rate of metastatic prostate cancer, and how this changes compared to breast cancer over time. It's very straightforward. I didn't even need to tell you what the manuscript was about. You can look at a single figure and get the entirety of what those authors are trying to convey. And references. If you've been asked to do this because you're a peer, meaning that you probably have some expertise in the field. If you're not in your comfort zone, if we incidentally reach out and you feel like that's a little outside my expertise, and I don't feel like I have that to be able to review this, you can either engage a friend or colleague to reread your review that is in that field. You can suggest another reviewer, because we need someone who's really going to be able to look at something critical like references. Did these authors specifically exclude something because they didn't want the contrary opinion highlighted in their manuscript? Or did they just inadvertently forget to add a reference that you know is critical to this field? We don't want them interpreting anything. You have to be able to look and determine, did they say that this reference said that when I really knew that it said something else? So put it into context, and that's where your expertise really comes in, because we can't know everything about all these fields, and so that's why you're chosen as a reviewer. So this is really an obligation to each other. Communication is critical to our scientific method. It is a profound opportunity for you as a reviewer to learn, to grow, to improve your ability for great patient care and your ability to move science forward. It is also a profound responsibility that we have for each other in this international community to get the highest level of evidence so we can give our patients the best care. You know, sometimes things get published even if they're very poorly designed. And so a poor idea can't really be saved by an excellent presentation, but an excellent idea that's well investigated can be doomed by poor presentation, but we'll do everything we can if it is an excellent idea to get that manuscript, to curate it, to make sure that it gets to the point where it's published. The Journal of the American Medical Association deputy editor made this very interesting commentary that there's no study that's too fragmented, trivial, biased, egotistical, warped, bungled, inaccurate, obscure, contradictory, self-serving, circular, trifling, unjustified, or offensive that it won't end up in print. And that's true because there's a lot of predatory publishing. There's a publishing section called Beale's List that really looks at these predatory publishing. And, we have a JU Open Plus journal where, as an American Urological Association member or a non-member, you can have a fee for service basically and pay for publication, but it has to still be adequately peer reviewed. It's not just paying to have your data out in the literature. And rejection happens to all of us. It's okay if you say, even for a manuscript that you know is from a very high profile author, it doesn't merit publication in this journal. And rejection happens. The best authors have all had their works rejected. Sometimes it's not for the right application in that journal, but it's okay for you to say it doesn't merit publication now, but for the authorship, and when you do your authorship, just don't give up. There's always going to be a place, and hopefully what you've done and learned as a reviewer is going to help you submit better manuscripts to start with. But hopefully what we do as a reviewer is going to help those authors along the journey so they'll find a place that's appropriate for publication. But what you don't do is send a note back to me that looks like this, that's in all caps, that has lots and lots of exclamation points about democratic principle and we're a fascist dictature with the election of our president. It's probably not going to get your article published in the Journal of Urology. We have lots of different journals in the AUA publication spectrum, as I mentioned, and sometimes we'll transfer from journal to journals. I will see an article in the Journal of Urology and think this is completely appropriate for the type of methodology that was utilized or the topic matter for urology practice, and transfer that laterally. Or, as I mentioned, JU Open Plus, our new open access journal. So you may face many defeats, but never let yourself be defeated. Regardless, we will find a place and try to help steward a manuscript through. And we really deeply appreciate all your efforts as peer reviewers to help these authors find a space to let their data out so we can all give the highest level of evidence and care for our patients. So I thank you very much for this opportunity. And please, feel free to email me. This is my email address, melissa.kaufman@vumc.org, with any questions that you have. I'm also delighted if you would email if you're willing to serve as a peer reviewer for the Journal of Urology, or if you are a subspecialist in reconstructive urology or female pelvic medicine and reconstructive surgery, for the neurourology and urodynamics. So thank you so much.